2 Corinthians chapter 8. There are many ways that people have come up with to train children. And if you look at how they train children today, or what the so called experts say you should do, I'm certain it'll leave you scratching your head at who came up with these ideas. I'm certain it was either someone that didn't have children, or if they did have children, they probably grew up and are in jail, because it does make you wonder what in the world they're thinking sometimes when it comes to raising children. Um, the idea of any kind of corporal punishment or anything along those lines has flown right out the door. It doesn't have anything to do with our sermon, really. But when it comes to raising children and teaching children, I can tell you that there is no greater thing that you can do than to live by example. And I think someone once said there's 3 things you need to do to raise a child correctly: be a good example, be a good example, be a good example. Those are the 3 things, because they will learn from you. There's absolutely no doubt about it. You can say one thing, and you can be one thing at church, but your children are going to pick up on all your habits that you have at home. And so we learn a lot about people, from their children. It doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly what they're like, because children grow up and they go on their own, and they learn some wild things sometimes in the world around them. But example, and that's exactly what Paul is doing here when we come to 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, and we're talking about giving. He is giving an example of how to do it and what it should look like. It's the Macedonians, and they're the prime example of giving as the way that God has prescribed it in the New Testament. Jim Elliot said, you might recognize Jim Elliot, he was missionary to the Auca Indians, real famous from, I think, the 1960s. I think he died before I was even born, but his story carried on for years and years and years. Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives away what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives away what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." That's how it goes. It's some people call Christianity foolishness, and they call Christians fools, and sometimes they talk about how crazy we are to give any amounts of money to the church or to anybody, because we need to take care of ourselves. And what Jim Elliot is hitting at is the point of it all, and that is, what? Why not give everything away when you're gaining eternal rewards? That's what really matters. And God hasn't called us to live in poverty necessarily. God has called some people to. Some people that are very good believers, very good Christians, they're not living in poverty. God hasn't necessarily said you need to take every dime that you have and give it to the church and just go live in a shack for the rest of your life. God hasn't said any of those things. And so when it comes to giving, it's very important that we come to a very good understanding of it, because we, one, don't want to shake the last dime out of someone's pocket and kick them to the curb when they can't give anymore, which it seems like a lot of ministries want to do. But we also don't want people to miss out on the tremendous blessings that God has in store with tremendous worship from giving. It is a behavior of the devout Christian. So when we came to 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, and we started talking about the area of Macedonia and the churches that were there, we talked about just how dirt poor they were. If there was a poor area, this was it. And yet Paul went around there and collected an offering from them for the church in Jerusalem. And we said in verse number 1, their giving was initiated by God's grace. It wasn't something that they just decided on their own to just go do. This was God's doing. God was leading. God was directing. Your leading and your directing and giving does not come from Pastor Matt. Your leading and directing does not come from any kind of pressures that a church might give upon you by showing up at your door and asking where your tithe is. That is not what is described in the Bible or in the New Testament. It is God's grace, and it starts with God working in your life. Secondly, their giving was transcendent of their difficult circumstances. In other words, just because they were being oppressed and persecuted and pushed down didn't mean that it absolved them from any responsibility in giving. God still was looking at them to give, even though it wasn't much. I'm sure if you only make $100 a year and you give $1 of it to God, I'm certain that is looked on God as tremendous blessings because you gave everything that you could. And your status that you have doesn't mean that you still don't give. And we discussed too that you can give in many different ways. I do believe that God still is asking people to give of their finances, but we can give of our time and we can give of our talents. There's tremendous things that you can do for God with your time and your talents. Thirdly, their giving was with joy, even in the ordeal of affliction. And we started seeing that in verse number 3. And as we're in verse number 3, there is all kinds of things that it has to say here about giving, and then we're going to dive into the Old Testament and see what how the New Testament and the Old Testament actually do line up with each other really well. But they still had joy in their giving. And I said verse number 3, but that's actually verse number 2, isn't it? Because how that in the great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy they gave. Fourthly, their giving was not hindered by poverty, but rather their deep poverty overflowed or abounded unto the riches of their liberality. So even though they were poor, they still gave in a tremendous way. Fifthly, their giving was liberal, and that was the last word there, right? Out of their liberality. It was generous, and it came out of their generosity. It came out of them thinking of others. So now we do come to verse number 3, and there is some things here that we want to study and see 3 points here in verse number 3 real quick, and then we'll dive into some Old Testament things. So the sixth thing that we see here in verse number 3 is their giving was proportionate. For to their power I bear record. So Paul is saying, I am testifying here. I have firsthand knowledge. I've seen this happen. This is experience that they gave according to their ability, for to their power, to their ability, with regard to their giving, they gave. So it is proportionate. It's out of what they had, not what they want to have, not what they hope to have in the future, but out of what they had right then and there, they gave out of that. And that's a great way for us to give. And I know people at times, things happen, and all of a sudden money comes for some reason, in the mail, or, something happens and some money shows up and you weren't anticipating it. Some people take that and give some of it or all of it or whatever portion of it to God, however they feel being led at that point in time. They gave out of what they had at that moment. Your giving has no set amount, and that's really what we're diving into. It's not a 10% amount. There is no fixed figure in the New Testament. God doesn't expect you to give and go into debt. You're to give out of what you have. And you're to give as God sets on your heart. All right? So that's number 6. Number 7, their giving was sacrificial. It's beyond what they could or would be expected of in such poor conditions. For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power. They went beyond what they should have been able to do. But they apparently understood their finances and knew I can give all the way up until this point and then I'm done. So they looked into the future a little bit too, didn't they? They dug down deep. Anything and everything that they had, they were giving. And I think giving in this way basically says, I'm going to trust God for what's going to happen. God's going to take care of me. And by the way, you can't outgive God. You can give, God's going to take care of you. We don't have to worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. God will take care of you. Now, the eighth thing that we see here, and the third in this verse, but the eighth thing, was they gave beyond their power. They were willing of themselves. The eighth point is their giving was voluntary. Not forced, not mandatory, not worrying if Pastor Matt's going to show up at my doorstep and wonder why I only give X amount of dollars. Most people in our church, by the way, give with cash. So I don't even know who's giving what. Some people give with checks, and that's fine. I don't even add them up. If anybody, by the way, if anybody ever needs their taxes, they need the amount that they gave, and they need some kind of thing written out. The church is required by law to keep that. We do have it. So I can fill that out and give it to you if you need it. Otherwise, I don't count. It's not up to me. I don't care. And by the way, that's only if you give, like, by a check, or if you use an envelope and put your name on it. Otherwise, you're just giving to God and no one's really worrying about it, right? I don't count it up. It's not up for me to decide. I don't think better of one person than another because of what a check might come in and look like, or what cash might come in an envelope. It's none of my business, really. You know what's business it is? It's your business and it's God's business. And it's between you and God. And God will help you figure that out. And you will figure that out between God. But if you follow all of these principles, then you'll be in a right relationship of giving. It's self-motivated and spontaneous. There's no bribery going on. I am never going to tell you, if you give me money, I'll pray for you. Or if you give the church money, I'll pray for you. Some places do that. Send us some money in an envelope and your prayer request, and we'll pray for you. We've got this great prayer team that's going to pray for you. It's not what prayer is about. It's not to make money. So, what do these verses say? Verse number 3 here, it says we are to give proportionate, we are to give sacrificially, and we're to give voluntarily. Those are three really important issues for us to discuss when looking in the Old Testament. This is where it kind of turns into a classroom, because people say, where is this 10%? We always hear about 10%. We always hear about a tithe. Where is that? Well, in these passages of scripture here, we're going through 2 Corinthians 8:9. The word tithe is not there. You will not find it. And this is all about giving. It's not listed. Rather, it says they gave sacrificially. They gave proportionately. They gave voluntarily. The 10% is a misunderstanding of the Old Testament. And I will tell you, just even before we get into the Old Testament, the 10% giving in the Old Testament was required giving. There was still a sacrificial, voluntary giving that was asked of God for them to do. But the 10% is a required giving that the Israelite folks had to go through. And by the way, it wasn't just one 10% giving. As we go through here, you're going to find out that it adds up to more like 33% or something along those lines. So let's look at the Old Testament a little bit. We won't necessarily turn to these verses, but you can take notes and look them up later if you want to. You can watch this on the internet later on, and you can look them up on your own if you want to. Let's start with the voluntary giving, by the way. It existed before Moses. It's been around for a long time. Genesis, a tithe, the tithe that we're going to talk about here, was a voluntary offering, and there's no command to do it. Genesis in chapter 4, we find the first offerings that were ever given. As I say Genesis in chapter 4, you might recognize that. This was made by to God by the first two sons of Adam and Eve. That's Cain and Abel. It was voluntary. God had revealed that they should give an animal sacrifice. Before this here, and we don't know how God revealed it to them. I'm assuming that God talked with Adam like he did. He used to walk around in the garden and talk with him. So I'm assuming afterwards, after the fall, God revealed to Adam what was required and what he was looking for in the animal sacrifices. And Adam told Cain and Abel what to do, how to do. And one made a wrong offering, didn't he? One wanted to say, I can do things my way, and I will do things my way. It sounds like the world today. I will get to heaven my way. Who is God to tell me that because I like to raise, fruits and vegetables, who is God to say that mine is not good? Right? That's literally what he was saying. He brought the wrong stuff. He got mad. He killed his brother. But it reveals his heart. And it had nothing to do with money. It was all about sacrifice. It was all about giving. We do not see a 10% there. It was simply, here's the requirements, you do it. One decided not to and killed the other. Genesis in chapter 8 is the next time we see some form of giving. This is Noah. It's at the end of the flood. Noah gets off the boat. First thing he does is he builds an altar and he makes an offering to God. And you know what that offering is for? Same reason why the animal sacrifice for Cain and Abel. I think it is an offering of thanksgiving and gratitude. Noah had been saved by God. Noah had been given all the dimensions for the ark. Noah built that ark for 120 years. God sent the flood, and he preached for 120 years, didn't he? And no converts. Great missionary, right? Preached for that long, and no one believed him. They thought he was crazy. He thought he was a lunatic. Then the waters came out of the sky, and now they all had a problem except for him and his family. They got on the ark. When they got off the ark, he wanted to give an offering of thanksgiving and gratitude to God. So Genesis chapter 8, verse number 20, it says, he presented burnt offerings of every clean beast and every clean bird. How much did he give? I don't know. Doesn't say 10%, does it? It was free will. God did not require it of him. God didn't say, Noah, the moment you get off that ark, I want you to give. And I want you to present an offering to me. Noah did it on his own. He did it out of love and thanksgiving and gratitude. Next time we see giving is in Genesis in chapter 12. It's by a guy by the name of Abram. That's his name at this point in time. Abram was called of God to lead the nations. His response out of the promises that God gave to him was to build an altar. And out of the joy of his heart and gratitude, he gives an offering. No command, no amount, no requirement. This is proportionate, sacrificial, and voluntary, just like we have in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, the first time we see the word tithe, Genesis chapter 14. Verses 18 through 20. Same guy, Abram. Later become known as Abraham. He goes to war. And he goes to war. If you think Abraham was some kind of weakling or not, a tremendous leader. He goes to war against 5 kings, and he wins. God gives him the victory. And when he gets the victory, he takes the spoils, which means he plunders the towns, he plunders the cities, he takes things that are worth any kind of value. So Abraham and his armies collect all of these things, all of these treasures, and he's going back home, and he runs into a guy by the name of Melchizedek. And at one point in time, we studied the order of Melchizedek, because that's in the New Testament, but it has to do with giving. Melchizedek, he's the king of Salem, which is ancient Jerusalem, but he's also a priest of God. So Melchizedek is a priest and a king, and he's really a type, there you go, of Jesus Christ that is to come. Like, we're going to show a little bit about who Jesus was. Who was Jesus? He was the ultimate king, the ultimate priest, right? Melchizedek was a priest and a king. He's a type of Christ. And Abraham comes along to him, and this man, Abram, wants to give thanks to God. He looks at Melchizedek, and he thinks, now is my opportunity to tell God, thank you. So what Abraham does is he gives a tithe to offer his thanks to God, and it's the first time that's ever mentioned. God did not tell Abraham how much to give. Abraham did it on his own. He gave 10%. It was not 10% of everything Abraham owned, by the way. It was a 10% of the spoils that he had. And it indicates, too, when you give this tithe, this 10%, the way it's written in the Hebrew, it was basically, he was taking the 10 best things that he had out of all of the spoils and gives them to Melchizedek as an offering to God. So it may have even been worth more than 10% of his spoils. It was the 10 best things that he really had, if you will. It's never, by the way, recorded that Abraham ever did that again. So when people say you have to give a tithe and you have to give 10% of all of your gross weekly income, and you need to do it weekly, there is no precedence for that in the Bible. Even Abraham, who did it once, is not a good example of that. Genesis chapter 28. Next time we see it. Jacob makes a vow. It's a spiritual low for Jacob, by the way. In verse 20 through 22, so Genesis 28, verses 20 through 22, he makes a vow to God, and he says, guard me, give me food and garments, and I'll let you be my God. What a great guy. Right? And how many people do this? Like, it's the foxhole Christian. And what is that? That's the guy in like the Vietnam War, and he's down in a foxhole, and the enemy's there, and they're shooting, and the bullets are whizzing over his head, and his buddy on his right and his buddy on his left have been hit, and they're dying. And he's in the hole cowering, saying, and he's praying to God now finally, God, just save me from this, and I'll give you everything I have. Right? That's exactly what Jacob is basically doing here. Guide me, give me food and my clothing, and I'll let you be my God. Thank you, Jacob. Then he gave a 10%. And by the way, it's what pagans did in the day in giving to their deities. Try to buy their God's blessings. And Jacob was trying to buy God's blessings. Next time, Genesis 41. Finally get to some required giving. Because I said that there's some required giving. There are some required tithes in the Old Testament. But it has nothing to do with how we give today. Kind of. You're going to see as we go through here, you do give a tithe. and you give it at least once a year. Joseph, he's sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. He's been interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. He's going to end up being the prime minister of Egypt. What a tremendous story. If you just read the story of Joseph, what amazing things happen to this guy. I mean, how can that even happen? You get thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and you end up being the prime minister of Egypt, and then your brothers come and beg for food from you later on and don't even know who you are. I mean, just a tremendous story, right? Joseph has a dream. You remember what the dream was? 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat cows. What was that? Still didn't gain weight. They were still skinny. That's right. And what that was a picture of was 7 years of all kinds of things coming in and 7 years of famine. You've got 7 years to prepare. So Joseph sets up that he's going to collect 20% of everything produced and stored it up. Pretty smart thinking, wasn't it? We've got some good years. We better collect it now because there's bad years coming. That's what's so scary about America's debt right now, isn't it? I mean, we seem flush with money and all kinds of things right now. And as far debt as we are in, if we hit really bad times, how we're going to get it out when we're this many trillions of dollars in debt already. Yeah. This is a tax. And so I'll tell you that governments that run on this kind of system, it does work. When you tax about 20% and you collect it and you don't, fraudulently spend it and do all kinds of things and go so far in debt, these types of governments over the course of time have all worked well. Free will giving is to God. The required giving is to government. So in Leviticus 27:30, there's a tithe. It calls it the Lord's tithe. It was divided among the Levites. If you weren't in the Levite clan, then you're required to give 10% of your land, your seed, your fruit, your animals, everything. And what did it supply? It supplied the needs of the Levites. Who were the Levites? They were the priests. They were the ministers, if you will, of the time. They had no income. They had no way to live. So when you came in and you gave your 10% tithe, it was to benefit the Levites so that they could keep doing the Lord's work. The Levites, by the way, had no land, had no territory. They weren't allowed to keep any. They worked for the people. They worked, and really, if you would think about it this way, they were basically some government workers. They did a lot for the people. And this was a theocracy, not a democracy. The millennial kingdom, by the way, will be that way. Theocracy is the rule of God. And he sets in order who is going to rule into which areas. A democracy is the people saying who's going to rule in what areas. This was a theocracy. This 10% was for the priests to do their work. Then in Deuteronomy chapter 12, there's a second tithe. So a second 10%. So now you got 20%. This was for religious ceremonies and festivals. You want to bring a nation together? Have big festivals together. That's what they were doing. We're going to celebrate 250 years of America, right? We'll see how much people can come together for that. When the Twin Towers fell, America came together. And that's the type of thing that they were looking for in this second 10% tithe. They would throw great big huge festivals across the land, food, all kinds of things going on. It was for those festivals. So that's 20%. Then there was some other percentages. One other that was mandatory, a third tithe, if you will. Deuteronomy 14:28. At the end of every third year, they had to give another 10%. It was for the stranger, the fatherless, the widows, or the poor, and this was called the poor tithe. So that totaled 23% tithe that you were to give, and it basically is like the government taxing you today. You say, yeah, Pastor Matt, a third of my check is gone just like that. And then I get charged for gas, and I get charged every time I buy food, and I get charged for profits, and I get charged for this, and I get charged for that, and I have land tax, and I have a tax on, walking down the road and, looking up at the sky, or whatever else they want to tax me for. They seem to do that, right? Well, that's true. We have some more taxes, but the nation Israel had some more taxes too. There were small little taxes that were added on, and they were mainly for those that had than those that didn't have. In Leviticus 9, verses 9 through 10, you could basically call it a profit sharing tax. That was when you harvested the fields, you left the corners of the fields empty. Or you didn't leave them empty, you didn't harvest them. That was for the widows. That was for the orphans. They could go out and collect the whatever you were harvesting. They could get a little bit for themselves. Also, if you put it, when you put it on the cart, if you're going down and the cart is shaking and things fall off, you weren't supposed to pick them up and put it back on the cart. That was for those people to collect too. So that would be like a profit sharing tax to help people. So, the Jew is required to do all of that. Basically, 23% plus. Feels a lot like where we're at right now. Numbers 18, verse number 12. You have your giving, that's a free will giving. In Numbers 18 and verse number 12, it says that they were to give of their best. They were to give the first fruits, which was their best. They would go out and start to collect the harvest, and that would be the first part. You would collect basically about 10% of your harvest, and that was the first stuff that came in, which is usually the best, especially if you do more than one harvest. That first batch that comes in is the best of your harvest. You don't know what else is going to come in, but you would collect that, and you would take it, and you would give it. And basically what would happen with that, especially if it was a harvest, the priests would use it to make bread for themselves and different stuff. They would be able to take and feed themselves. But that's what you did. Now, maybe the harvest ended up being greater than you thought. Then, you didn't end up giving 10%. But maybe the harvest was bad. You don't know what's to come. You were to still give of that first and the best. You weren't supposed to collect it all and go, okay, now let me see what I have here. I guess I'll give this amount to God. The first group came in, and you didn't know if it was 10% or what. It was a free will offering. You just grabbed it, and you gave. And you trusted God with the rest. Proverbs 11:24 says, there is one who scatters, yet increases all the more. One who withholds what is justly due, and it results only in want. Tremendous verse, isn't it? Proverbs 11:24. In other words, the one that takes and scatters the first, it just goes and it reproduces and God takes care of him. Then the one who holds it all, you know what happens to him? He just wants more. Sounds like some people that are multi-billionaires today that I don't even know why. Once you become a billionaire, why are you even still working and why are you still making money? What are you doing with all of that? You can't even, it's mind-boggling how much $1 billion is. And so the point here is, give of the best and God will take care of you. Don't give correctly, and all you will do is want more, and you'll want, and you'll want, and you'll want. You want the peace that only God can give? Give of your best. Give how God has designed. Pay your taxes and give what your heart tells you. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament says, pay your taxes and give what your heart tells you, and God will take care of you. That's the New Testament. Romans 13 says, pay your taxes. 1 Corinthians 16 says, give freely of your heart. 2 Corinthians 8:3, for to their power I bear record. Yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves. they gave with their hearts. That's how we're to give today. I'm glad you came tonight. Those are some tremendous things for us to learn about giving. Let's have a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we do just thank you for this lesson that you gave. Speaking on money can always be a little difficult. But Father, we know that you put these things in here so that we can be a blessing to you and that you would bless us back. Father, I pray that as we think of giving, we won't just take underneath some kind of pressure and underneath some kind of vaulted sense of who we are and just show the world that we're not of the world, so we're going to give everything that we ever had to the church and receive that kind of glory that way. Father, may we just truly seek your face, and as you lead, guide, and direct, may we be willing to give as you are guiding us. And Father, as we give of that free will, of that free heart, as we give proportionately, and as we give just beyond our measures even sometimes, I pray, Lord, that you will just give us great blessings and that we will see that and that we will give you the great honor and glory because of everything you're doing in our lives. Father, we ask these things in your name. Amen.